Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing great because I have just reread, in English this time, a wonderful little book. The book in question is Vies Imaginaires, or Imaginary Lives, by Marcel Schwab. Marcel Schwab is one of the most amazing, underrated authors that you are likely to read. The first thing that you're going to find if you look him up is probably this. He was a great influence on Jorge Luis Borges. So what do you say? Let's get the Borges connection out of the way, okay? And I'll tell you in a minute why I say that. So 2 points here. The first one is that Borges's collection of stories, the first one that he published, which is titled in Spanish Historia Universal de la Infamia. In English it has the title A Universal History of Iniquity or A Universal History of Infamy, whichever you prefer. This was modeled after Imaginary Lives by Marcel Schwab. The other point is that Borges included Imaginary Lives in his Biblioteca Personal, in his collection of the best books that he had ever read. And he makes a few points about it that I wanted to share with you just very briefly to look at what Borges thought about Marcel Schwab and his little book. He tells us that the Imaginary Lives were published in 1896 and that the method that Schwab followed when writing these stories was a very curious one. He says the protagonists are real, the facts may be fabulous, and they are often fantastic. The peculiar taste of this volume is in this oscillation between facts and the fantastic or the fabulous. He also tells us that Schwab did not look for fame. He wrote deliberately for the happy few, and he uses that phrase in English right here. And then after that, of course, he tells us that towards 1935 he wrote a book titled A Universal History of Iniquity, and that one of its many sources was Imaginary Lives by Marcel Schwab, and he also adds that critics had not realized that, and this is a text that was written in the 1980s, so that is interesting in itself. So why did I say let's get the Borges connection out of the way? Here's why. I think that no author should be reduced to the Borges connection. So in this video, what we're going to do is we are going to talk about Marcel Schwab. We're not going to talk about Jorge Luis Borges. We have plenty of time to talk about Jorge Luis Borges in the future. We certainly will. And I will tell you about A Universal History of Iniquity soon. But in the meantime, we are going to explore the world and the work of Marcel Schwab. So Marcel Schwab was born in 1867 and he passed away in 1905. He did not publish many books. He was not very prolific, but he had a tremendous influence in many great authors. He's mostly known for his fiction, which has a little bit of a taste of poetry to it. I would say that his style is among the most personal and the most quote-unquote original that I have found in my reading experience. Now, Imaginary Lives may not be his most famous book. That would probably be The Children's Crusade, which is the one that many people have pointed out as an influence on William Faulkner. They are thinking particularly of As I Lay Dying, because both of these books have a multi-perspective approach. So you hear the story from different characters and from different viewpoints. And then another book of his, the Book of Monel, is said to have inspired André Gide, in particular the book The Fruits of the Earth, which by the way is an excellent text and I recommend it absolutely. So going back to Imaginary Lives, this was published in 1896, just like The Children's Crusade, so that was a wonderful year for Marcel Schwab. And I think the best way to describe Imaginary Lives is as a gallery of portraits. What we get here is a wonderful series of biographical sketches. And what kind of characters do we find here? For the most part, the type of character that we have here is a marginal figure. So underdogs, misfits, even scoundrels, I would say. Not all of them. There are a couple of exceptions, and I'm going to tell you about one of them in particular. So as I read the book, I was thinking of two types of texts where you can find biographies, right? One of them is obviously encyclopedias. And then the other type of book where you can find this type of thing, the biography, is those collections of the lives of the saints. I think Imaginary Lives is, in a way, the opposite of that. It is an anti encyclopedia. It is a book that might be titled The Lives of the Sinners, except for those couple of cases that I told you before that do not fit into this category of the misfit or the scoundrel. So, Imaginary Lives comes with a wonderful preface by Schwab. The preface is just as good as the book itself, which is something that is difficult to find, something very rare for the most part. And in that preface, Schwab, what he does is to explain his approach. He begins by comparing history and biography. And this is what he has to say about it. I wanted to share his words with you. He says the historical sciences leave us uncertain about the individual. Art stands in opposition to general ideas, describing only the individual, desiring only the unique. The book that describes a man in all his irregularities will be a work of art, like a Japanese print, where we can forevermore see the likeness of a little caterpillar, glimpsed on a single occasion, at a certain hour of the day. So you can see also what I mean by his very personal poetic style. He exalts unknown characters. If history is about the protagonists, then his imaginary lives are going to be about those characters that we do not know that much about. That is what he is concerned with. And he gives us the example, and I think it's a very good one, of Mona Lisa. Right? Mona Lisa, who has the power to captivate spectators who know virtually nothing about her. And Marcel Schwab even adds that that face of Mona Lisa could be the face of a man. So that's how little we know about this character, and yet how powerful is the effect of this painting. Now, there are many names that you are going to recognize if you look at the table of contents of this gallery of characters. Empedocles, for example, Herostratus, Lucretius, Petronius, Paolo Uccello. Okay, you have Pocahontas. She's the one that I was telling you before does not really fit into that category of the misfit or the scoundrel. You can certainly call her a marginal character because her history was not written from her perspective. But you see what I mean when I say that she is a bit of an exception. We also have Captain Kidd. And then there are other characters that you might not recognize, but that are tied to a very important historical person. For example, Cecco Angiolieri, he is connected to Dante. And there are many other cases. For example, Nicolas Loiseleur, he is connected to Joan of Arc. Major Stede Bonnet, he is related historically to Blackbeard. So that is the connection. We are told the story from the perspective of the underdog or the unknown character. So I was thinking about that, and to me, it seems that Schwab's approach is postmodernist, before postmodernism, because what he is doing is he's telling us history from the perspective of the quote-unquote secondary character. I was thinking of Barabbas, that book that I told you about a few months ago, probably, by Per Lagerkvist. You get the story of what happened after the crucifixion of Christ from the perspective of the secondary character, who is Barabbas. So, my favorites. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the stories from this collection that I liked the most. I really liked the one about Petronius, okay, because it has a different ending. Much of the effectiveness, I would say, of Imaginary Lives relies on that ending. So he was one of those authors, Schwab was, who relied really on a powerful ending, a powerful final sentence. So Petronius, we get a different ending to his life than the one that you might read from an encyclopedia. And of course, as I read it, I thought of the Satyricon and my experience with that, and also the great historical novel Quo Vadis by Henryk Sienkiewicz. It's a great one. I mean, it's very long, but highly recommended. I also liked the story of Sufra. Okay, this is a geomancer, and the story has the air of the 1001 Nights, so immediately I really liked it. Paolo Uccello also has a very interesting story. His story is the story of the artist who is consumed by his work, and due to that theme, I also thought of Balzac's The Unknown Masterpiece. It's a great novella. I talked about it briefly in that video that I did on great novellas that everyone should read. And another, text that I recommend to you, but that was one connection that I made. I also liked the story of William Phipps, who was a treasure hunter. And that's one story in particular that I think has a very effective and also very pathetic ending. That was one of the reasons why it spoke to me. The last story in the English version of the book, which is not the same one as in the Spanish one, I'm going to tell you about that soon, is the story of Burke and Hare, who were two murderers, two serial killers who collaborated, if you will. So that one was very effective and quite memorable too. But my favorite stories of all the ones that I read here was the story of Cyril Tourneur, he is described as a tragic poet. And the reason why I liked this one was because this is such a dark character. So if you're going to read one of these stories, if you want to sample the imaginary lives, make it the story of Cyril Tourneur, because I think it's one of the best written in the collection. Now, I want to tell you about the translation, okay? So I've read Imaginary Lives in Spanish and in English. So what I did to assess the English translation was, and the Spanish one also, was the following. I grabbed my favorite story, which is the one of Cyril Tourneur, as I've just told you. I read it in the original, in French, and then I read once again the Spanish and the English translations. And what I think is that both of those, the Spanish and the English versions, are just very well done. They are excellent. They had the same effect on me as the original text. So that's my take on that. The English translation was done by Chris Clark. It was published by Wakefield Press. Chris Clark is a famous translator. He has translated Patrick Modiano. He did In the Café of Lost Youth. He also translated Raymond Queneau and many other French authors. And as a matter of fact, his translation of The Imaginary Lives won an award. Another good thing about it is that it comes with an amazing afterword. Okay, I would say that the price of this book is worth it just because of the afterword. Because one thing he does in that text is that he looks at the influences of Marcel Schwab, not the authors that he influenced, but the authors that came before him. So he mentions, for example, Stevenson. Marcel Schwab was a translator of Stevenson, so you can definitely feel the influence of Stevenson in The Imaginary Lives. He also talks about Thomas de Quincey, another author that Borges admired very much, and for my money, one of the most wonderful stylists of prose in English. So if you have not read Thomas de Quincey, I definitely recommend him. Chris Clark also talks about the notions of plagiarism and borrowing, which is something central to the work of Marcel Schwab and also to the authors that he influenced. So that translation and that edition is just really, really nice. And then the Spanish one, which I have right here, this was the first, or my first experience of The Imaginary Lives, the one in Spanish. It's published by Alianza Editorial, and the translation is by Antonio Álvarez de la Rosa. It has a very good introduction, and a really cool thing about it is that it has an extra text at the very end. So after the text on Burke and Hare, which is where the English version ends, you have something here titled Life of Morphiel. I was like, that's weird, where does this text come from? Here's the thing. So it turns out that the texts that are included in this book were originally published in a newspaper. And then Marcel Schwab took them and compiled them into a book. But when he did that, he left out this Life of Morphiel and he replaced it with the text on Pocahontas. So maybe that's why the text on Pocahontas doesn't really fit in. It's slightly, out of place in the collection, though it's still amazing. But I thought that what they did in the Spanish version to include this text going against the author's wishes in a way was a very good thing to do, because you get that extra if you're still wanting more after the reading of these wonderful little biographical sketches. Okay, random quote. What do you say? Okay, let's read something at random just to get an idea of the style. When I was planning this video, I just opened this book. It opened on page 79. This is the text on Paolo Uccello, and I'm just going to read you a little bit of it. Much like the alchemist who stood hunched over his mixtures of metals and compounds, and who, searching for gold, watched for them to fuse together in his oven, Uccello poured each and every shape into the melting pot of all shapes. He joined them together, he combined them, he melted them down, all in his quest to obtain their transmutation into pure form, one upon which all others would depend. That is why Paolo Uccello lived like an alchemist in the back of his small house. He believed that he could transform all lines into one ideal aspect. He wished to forge a conception of the universe that was created in the same way it was reflected in the eye of God, who sees all figures spring forth out of a complex center. So that is page 79 of the English translation, and I think it gives you a really good idea of the style of Marcel Schwab. Bottom line, Marcel Schwab influenced many great authors. That goes without saying. Without a doubt, that is the case. We have mentioned Borges, Faulkner, we mentioned André Gide. We could also add to the list Roberto Bolaño. We could also add Pierre Michon. He has a book titled Small Lives, which is also modeled after the imaginary lives. And then a Chilean author who is receiving a lot of attention right now, Benjamin Labatut. He is a great author, by the way, and I also recommend him. He has also been influenced directly or indirectly by Marcel Schwab. But Marcel Schwab was also an excellent and a very interesting author in himself. Okay, so he is an author that in his own right produced a great body of work. Imaginary Lives, if you ask me, is the best place to begin with Marcel Schwab. So if you have not explored his work, by the way, don't feel bad about it, because that is the case of many of us. And if I am the one to introduce you to him, I can tell you I'm very, very happy about that. So I would say start with the Imaginary Lives, then you can move on maybe to the Children's Crusade, then maybe the Book of Monel, or The King with the Golden Mask, which is another collection of short stories. Most of the time, as you know, when we read a text, we tend to focus on the plot. But what a wonderful idea, instead of focusing on plot, to focus on the characters and their idiosyncrasies, the characters who push the plot forward. And I think Imaginary Lives is a fantastic opportunity to do that. That is one of the many reasons why I have enjoyed this book so much. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those are my 2 cents on Vies Imaginaires, Imaginary Lives by Marcel Schwab. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.